Would you help me welcome today David Murrow as our special guest to CZV?
Thank you.
There's got to be more than just setting the masculine environment for church. How, once you get men to church, do you take them to the next level?
That is the $64,000 question we're facing today. I don't know if you realize this, but the Promise Keepers organization that was so big in the 90s has basically imploded. A lot of men's ministries, it's just very hard to get a group of men, and everybody's kind of scratching their head and wondering, what's the next thing for men? And so I've actually got a book coming out in March of 2010, and I want to share just a little bit of that with you.
Excellent.
With a drawing that I've made. First of all, before we talk about men in the church, I need to talk to you about a man's natural journey. And I'm just going to make a little drawing here of a mountain, which we'll call the Mountain of Manhood. And this mountain has two sides. It's got a soft, feminine side and kind of a tough, strong, masculine side. And I think you would agree with me that for a man to be fully well-developed man, he has to get in touch with both of his feminine and his masculine side. You don't want to have him too soft or too hard, right? And when you think of great men such as Jesus Christ, wouldn't you say that Jesus Christ is equally balanced between the masculine and feminine? You with me so far? Now, when men start their journey, they actually start in a very feminine world. Men, I've got some bad news for you. Did you realize that every one of you started off life as a female? That's right. Every human egg is only female. And so you actually began as a female, but then at the moment of conception, you became a male and you began the process of differentiating yourself from your feminine past. But for the first few years of your life, you pretty much stayed on the feminine side of the mountain. Psychologically, emotionally. I mean, your first 9 months of your life, you were literally surrounded inside of a woman's body. It doesn't get much more female than that. And then first couple years of your life, you were pretty much taken care of by your mother and other female caregivers. If you fell down and got an owie, you cried. If your mother put you in pink, that didn't bother you. You played with your sister's dolls and kitchen toys. You didn't really develop this idea that you were masculine until you got to about the age 5 or 6. You started getting into school, and all of a sudden you couldn't play with dolls anymore, could you? You had to start doing guy things. You had to get interested in baseball and football and stuff. And so psychologically, you began a journey over toward the masculine side of the mountain. And when you got to be 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, it became your constant obsession to be masculine. You wouldn't touch anything feminine with a 10-foot pole. And you learned all these rules, like it was totally cool to sit with one girl, but you couldn't sit with a group of girls. Right? There was all these men rules that you had to do. And by the time you reach 18 or 19-year-olds, you were doing all kinds of stupid things to prove your manhood. You were jumping off of things, and you were putting 22s on your car, and you were shooting guns, and you were doing all this macho stuff. And you ended up in a region called the Manly Foothills. And these are little tiny hills that are a sort of a replica of the Mountain of Manhood, but they're all about being macho, being manly. You guys know any men who are stuck in the Manly Foothills? You probably do, right? All right? Common place for men to end up. This is the common journey that men go on. And so I began to wonder, okay, how do you get from here to here? How do you put that, how do you stay a healthy masculine while you get rid of the macho? And so I thought, well, I just need to turn to the example of the greatest man who ever lived, Jesus Christ. So I opened up my Bible, and I prayed, and I said, God, show me how you became a man. And I saw an amazing thing. Oh, God doesn't usually speak to me. I'm not one of these real mystical guys, but I heard something in my voice. Speed read the Gospels. Heard this little voice in my head. Speed read the Gospels. That's unusual. Usually I read very slowly and carefully and study the Word. And I thought, well, okay, I'll do it. And so I just looked for this pattern, and I only got through the Gospel of Matthew, and I found the most amazing way to get up the mountain. And let me show you what I found. First of all, I found 3 journeys of manhood in the life of Jesus. I found a journey of submission, a journey of strength, and a journey of sacrifice. And here's where they're found. In Matthew 1 through 7, we find a Jesus who's very submissive. He comes to earth as a baby, utterly powerless. He submits himself to baptism, to temptation. And then if you read the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, what are the great themes? Blessed are the meek, turn the other cheek, do not resist an evil person, do not judge. I mean, if you stop at Matthew 7, you come up with a pretty wimpy Jesus, right? Well, then when you go to Matthew 8 through 25, he comes down that mountain. He's a completely different Savior. He is completely strong. He's rebuking Pharisees and casting out demons and creating miracles and transfiguring. I mean, he's just big, big Jesus. And then in Matthew 26 through 28, he changes back. his whole direction changes. He allows himself to be arrested. He doesn't stand up for himself. He allows himself to be flogged and crucified and sacrifices his life. Now, if we would diagram this on the map, here's how I would see this. The first journey of Jesus took him in a more classic feminine direction. He moved toward soft, gentle, nurturing, blessed are the meek, that sort of thing. That was the predominant personality traits that we see in Jesus in his first journey. When he comes down from the Sermon on the Mount, he completely changes into a more classic masculine pattern. That's when he's doing all the miracles, rebuking, casting out demons, all this amazing stuff that we remember from Sunday school. And then finally, in his final journey, his journey of sacrifice, he moves again toward a more feminine perspective. He allows things to happen to him. He doesn't fight back. He's more passive, etc., etc. So I found this pattern in the Bible, and I was really blown away by it. And I thought, I wonder if this is a template, if Matthew was trying to show us a template for how we are supposed to develop emotionally as men. Maybe this is the path up the mountain to manhood. Maybe our first journey is a journey of submission. And this is frightening for men, because look at this. For 10, 12, 14, 20 years, we've been moving in a masculine direction. And when Jesus calls us to discipleship, what's the first thing we got to do? Move back in the direction that we've been fleeing our whole life. And that's why conversion can be a difficult thing for a guy. But when a man finally breaks before God, what happens? You see him all crying and everything. He starts building his relationships. He kind of goes in the feminine direction, doesn't he? I mean, I did. When I became a Christian, I became a softer guy, and that was a good thing for a while. But I didn't want to hang out there permanently. And in fact, now let me go back to the slide here. The other cool thing that I realized when I went back through the scriptures is I realized that many of the greats of the Bible also walked the three journeys. It wasn't just Jesus. Moses, Jesus Christ, and Paul are probably the three best examples of men who walked these three journeys. And if you'll allow me, let me show you Moses' journey on here. Moses was a typical man who grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. He grew up in he was snatched from death as a child, but he was taken to Pharaoh's court. He grew up among the philosophers and the wise men. The Pharaoh, his big rich daddy, powerful daddy, he's growing up in the court of the king. And then one day, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And he does a typical man reaction. I'm going to take matters into my own hands. He goes up to the Egyptian and kills him and buries the body in the sand. Well, word gets around, and all of a sudden Moses starts fleeing for his life. He goes into the desert, and for 40 years, he's in an exile in the desert. 40 years, he goes this direction. Instead of being the big shot son of the king now, he's an outlaw. He's a fugitive. He's submitting. He's being humbled. Instead of hanging out with the wise men, he hangs out with the goats. And by the way, anytime you see the desert in the scriptures, somebody in the desert, he's on his journey of submission. Jesus did it. The people of Israel did it. Jacob did it. They've all done it. He ends up in a very humble place. One day he's walking around, hanging out with the sheep, and he sees this bush on fire, and the bush talks to him and says, take your shoes off. That's a symbol of submission. And then God talks to him through the bush, and he says, I want you to go on a journey of strength. I want you to free my people from Pharaoh. And what does Moses say? Yeah, finally my journey of strength's over. My journey of submission's over. I can be strong. What does he say? No, he says, because this is what happens. Men get used to going this direction towards softness and passivity, and they get stuck here. And Moses was no exception, and he gives God all these excuses. Finally, God tells him, look, you got to go. So he screws up his courage, and he moves back in the direction of strength, and you know the whole story, parting of the sea and 12 plagues, and he's a very strong guy. Moses leads his people through. He's the judge of the people out in the wilderness. He's working long hours. Any of you men work long hours? He's doing everything on all the responsibilities on himself. He's way over here in the journey of strength. And his father-in-law comes to him one day and he says, Moses, you're working too hard. You need to delegate some of your authority to other people. And so Moses starts pouring his life into other men. He starts giving up his authority as a judge. He designates his successor, Joshua. And eventually, he moves back in this direction. He gives up all of his power and authority that God gave him during his journey of strength. He gives it up to others. And eventually, at the age of 120, he literally stands at the top of a mountain and dies. Guys, that's how I want to go out, at the age of 120 on top of a mountain. Booyah!